My name is Aria Kane, and I was never meant to be silent, for silence breeds rot, and in the dark corners of this city, rot grows like ivy, wrapping itself around every pillar of power, choking truth until it suffocates. But I will not suffocate, I will not bow. I will not break, because this is my confession and my declaration of war, and I will tell it all with no hesitation until the last secret is bled dry. I was once the daughter of a man who believed in the system, who believed that men in suits and polished words could protect the weak. He worked tirelessly in city archives, documenting truth, preserving history, ensuring every file, every record, every law would be remembered and honored, but memory was never enough when power decided what to erase. There was a man who rose from shadows of politics, a charming devil with silver tongue and promises so grand they glittered brighter than the city lights. He took my father as records and twisted them, erased names, rewrote laws, buried truths, and when my father objected, he silenced him not with chains, not with prison, but with disgrace and whispers. And then the whispers turned to accidents, and the accidents turned to graves, and my father was gone, leaving me with silence that tore through bone. I was young, but rage carved me into steel. I watched my mother drown in grief, watched her eyes hollow and her voice weaken until she too disappeared, leaving me orphaned in a city that devoured orphans like breadcrumbs for rats. And in the alleys I swore to myself that if silence was a weapon, then I would learn to wield sound like thunder. I grew teeth and claws in the underbelly of this city. I learned where secrets slept in forgotten files and burnt archives. I learned how men like him thrived not on truth, but on control. Not on justice, but on manipulation. And as I watched him rise from councilman to governor, I wrote his sins in my mind, line by line, until they etched themselves into my blood. Years passed, and I became invisible to him, but visible to his world. I entered his circles as a clerk, then as an assistant, then as someone trusted to hold his schedules, his memos, his secrets. He looked at me and saw nothing but another loyal shadow. Yet I was not his shadow, I was his executioner in waiting. Every meeting he held, every deal he cut, every betrayal he signed, I recorded in silence, not with pen and paper, but with memory sharpened like blades. And as his empire of lies grew, I built my archive not of dusty files, but of blood debts. And when the weight was heavy enough to crush him, I decided to strike. But revenge is never simple for predators. Always smell when prey stops trembling, and he began to sense something in me. Perhaps it was the fire in my eyes. Perhaps it was the silence that carried not fear but calculation. And so he sent his dogs after me. Whispers first, then threats, then shadows tailing me through streets and alleys, but they underestimated a woman forged in grief. I dragged his shadows into darker corners where silence breaks bones. I fed his hunters to the city they once ruled, and left their bodies as warnings carved in echoes. And still he smiled on podiums, shaking hands with children, kissing the air, as though blood did not drip beneath his nails. Then came the night I chose to burn the silence wide open. I walked into his rally dressed not as a servant, not as a clerk, but as the storm itself. And in my pocket I carried more than a weapon, I carried truth evidence of every betrayal, every bribe, every murder cloaked as accident, and when his voice filled the air, I cut through it with mine. I screamed his sins before the crowd, before the cameras, before the world, and for a moment silence cracked like glass and his smile faltered. Yet men like him do not fall easily. They twist truth into knots and feed it back to the people as lies sweeter than honey, and so he called me mad, unstable, grieving still, and the world wavered between believing me and believing him. So I vanished not in defeat, but in strategy, for if words alone could not bring him down, then blood would finish what truth could not. And in shadows I built my army, not of soldiers, but of the forgotten, the workers. He cheated the mothers, he shamed the fathers, he buried beneath debt. The children he starved of futures. They became my allies not by promises, but by fury. And in fury we found unity. We moved like smoke through his empire, cutting wires, severing loyalties, leaking fragments of his truths, until cracks spread like wildfire, and his men turned on him one by one. Yet still he stood at the center, untouched, smug in belief that I was only a ghost chasing storms, but ghosts are not powerless. Ghosts haunt and haunt until walls collapse. The final night came like thunder. I walked into his mansion, not with stealth, but with fire alarms blaring and shadows screaming behind me. He tried to run, tried to hide behind his guards, behind his walls, behind his lies, but truth walked faster, and I cornered him in the very study where he erased my father's name. He looked at me, and I saw no fear, only arrogance, as if even with a blade at his throat he believed he could survive. He spoke of power, of politics, of legacy, but I silenced him with one truth, whispered like a curse: you destroyed my family, and now I will erase yours. And when I drove steel into his chest, silence finally returned, but it was not the silence of submission. It was the silence of justice, brutal, merciless, and final. I disappeared that night, leaving the city with a corpse and a legacy of questions. Some called it murder. Some called it justice. Some called it madness. But I call it balance. For every lie, every betrayal, every stolen breath, there must be reckoning. Now, I write this not as plea, not as defense, but as confession, because silence can be rewritten, but words once spoken cannot be undone, and I choose to carve these words into stone for the city to remember me, not as a victim, not as a clerk, not as an assistant, but as Aria Kane, the woman who turned silence into thunder and thunder into justice. And if you hear my voice, know this: there are more like him, and more like me, and every empire built on lies will eventually drown in the noise of those they tried to silence.